Good morning or good afternoon. I'm not sure where we're at. I'm Paul Fari. I'm with the Washington Post. I'm the media reporter. Um, and we have an all-star panel here to discuss this film and the issues surrounding the death of Jamal Khashoggi. Let me introduce in some order or other. Uh, First of all, Tom LeGros, to my right, is the senior producer of this film and the senior producer, video producer at the Post. He oversees video editors on the Foreign National Security, Technology, and Features desks. He was part of the team that was awarded the 2018 Pulitzer Prize in investigative reporting for the coverage of Roy Moore, the Senate candidacy of Roy Moore, and the subsequent efforts by Roy Moore and his team to discredit the Post's reporting. Next to him, another Pulitzer Prize winner, Greg Miller, who covers national security. You saw him in the film. He is the author of The Apprentice, Trump, Russia, and the Subversion of American Democracy. In addition to being among the Post reporters who were awarded the 2018 Pulitzer Prize for the coverage of Russia's interference in the 2016 election, he was also part of the team that was awarded the 2014 Pulitzer Prize for public service for the Post stories about U.S. surveillance that were exposed by by Edward Snowden. Next to me is Sabine Dolan, who is the interim North American director for Reporters Without Borders. No Pulitzer, so, all right, but we'll still welcome you here. Now, throughout her wide-ranging career, Sabine was has wide international international experience in broadcast journalism, film production, and humanitarian and philanthropic efforts. She has been in the front lines in humanitarian emergencies and international development and human rights. She's also worked in broadcast news as a show producer, writer, and field producer for CNN, the BBC World Service, the AP, and Reuters. And next to her, Courtney Ratch. Did I say it right? Oh, thank you. She is a doctorate. She is advocacy director at the Committee to Protect Journalists. She is the chief spokesperson on global press freedom issues for the organization and oversees CPJ's engagement with the United Nations. She's also a veteran journalist, researcher, and free expression advocate. So we will open this at the end. Let's have a little discussion now, but at the end, to your questions about this film and about the issues that it raises. But I want to start with Greg. And Greg, since this film was produced, there has been some developments, and I'm wondering if you could basically update us on what has occurred since.
Sure. So the most recent development, of course, came this week. The United Nations released a report, 101 pages, which I think gives, actually was quite revealing. It is largely based on the United Nations investigators' ability to listen to not only the recordings that Turkish intelligence had from inside the consulate when Khashoggi is killed, but calls back and forth between the consulate and the kingdom in Riyadh in the days leading up to that. And to me, I mean, I think that even as recently as a few days ago, there were uncertainties in our coverage and in our minds about what exactly happened to some degree. We know he was killed, we know he died. We never knew for certain that this wasn't a botched kidnapping operation. It seemed unlikely, but not something that seemed possible to disprove. I think that the UN report kind of removes any doubt about that. I don't know if you've seen it or seen any coverage of it, but it talks about references inside the consulate between two of the individuals who had been dispatched by the kingdom to carry out this operation, referring to Jamal as a sacrificial animal. Is he here yet? Talking in advance about the mechanics of dismembering him and hauling away the parts of his body. So it in my mind, removes any doubt about what the intent was of sending this team. And it also focuses the United Nations attention on what's happening in Saudi Arabia now, which is some trials which are very opaque. There's, the report faults the Saudi, is so critical of those proceedings that it says that they really should come to a halt and restart in adherence with international investigative and criminal charges standards. So it's quite a damning document. It tells us more about what happened to Jamal, but of course it only underscores the bottom line that this is a murder of a journalist who was fighting for press freedoms, among others, and that those who are most accountable have so far escaped accountability.
I have a question about the Senate resolution that was passed yesterday, I believe. Is that going to make any difference at all?
I guess yes and no. I mean, any kind of resolution like this, it adds to the pressure on the kingdom, but obviously the United States is schizophrenic on this issue because the Trump administration is working in the opposite direction to try to protect MBS and the kingdom. So, I mean, if you don't have a unified U.S. condemnation and calls for a resolution here, it's hard to see how this leads to any accountability for MBS or those in the upper reaches of the royal family.
Tom, let me go over to you. This isn't just any news story. This is very personal to all of us at the Washington Post and generally to any press freedom advocate. But having produced it at the Washington Post, is there some issue over the distance to the subject in creating a film like this? Because it is personal and emotional, does that present a challenge?
Yes and no. The team that produced this piece, we didn't know Jamal personally. We'd never met him. We certainly were familiar with his columns. We knew who he was, and we knew that he wrote for the Post. I personally know people on the editorial side of the Post who worked with Jamal and knew Jamal. I knew his editor, Karen. So, there was definitely a very dark, sad time for that group, and it was very traumatic. For me, it was almost like a rapid progression of feeling sadness for my colleagues, and then shock at what actually had occurred, and then moving to focus on doing our jobs. We had to approach it as we would any big story, and this was a very big story. And it was one that we felt probably a special responsibility to the Post and to our colleagues to put a lot of time and energy and resources behind it. Yeah.
Other than his appearance in the film, did Fred Ryan give any guidance? Did he direct any of the editorial choices made in the film?
Not at all, no. Fred was very gracious with his time with us with the interview. He gave us access to his letter that he wrote, but all of our direction really came from people like Cameron Barr and Marty Barron. It went through the channels that a typical reported story would go through.
That's great. Courtney, I was struck by something that Karen Attias said in the film, and that is if MBS thought Khashoggi was an irritant before his death, that afterwards now he's created a martyr. But maybe the question is where does this end up? What would be justice? How would it be resolved in any fashion?
Yeah, I don't know that, I mean, he certainly has created a martyr, but what I think that this murder did was really emphasize to the world just how dangerous being a journalist is around the world, even when you think that you work in a safe place. And it helped the world realize that actually journalists are killed on a regular basis. At least 50 for the past several years have been killed. And last year, there was a significant increase in the number of journalists who were murdered. So actually, since we began keeping records at the Committee to Protect Journalists in 1992, the vast majority of journalists who are killed are murdered. So this means that they're murdered in retaliation for their work. But this particular murder really stood out because it took place in a third country. It was so brutal, and it was done despite the fact that, I mean, I don't see how they could have gotten away with it. And it is almost like it's testing the United States and testing the international system to see whether they're going to put Saudi Arabia, on trial and bring them to justice. So following this report, there is a clear path to justice. First, the UN Secretary General needs to open a criminal investigation. What Agnès Callamard, as the UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killing, did is an independent investigation. It's a human rights investigation. She gets very little funding by the UN, and the point of this is to spur action. So the Secretary General has argued that he doesn't have the right to kind of start this investigation without an official request from a member state, and she basically labels that absurd. Second, it calls on the US to make the intelligence information about what happened public. It calls on the Global Magnitsky Act sanctions to be applied to the Crown Prince and other sanctions that the European Union and other countries have imposed on low-level officials to also be imposed on MBS, because there is no way in Saudi Arabia that this could have happened without, at the very least, his knowledge, likely his responsibility. So instead of waiting to confirm a smoking gun, put the sanctions on and make him show that he was not responsible. And it calls for hearings in Congress. And there is some movement there. There's a bill right now on the floor that calls for this type of action. But I think that right now we're certainly not going to get justice from the Trump administration. And his rhetoric that you saw in this film is really shocking, because it sends a signal around the world that the United States is no longer going to stand up for journalists. They're not going to defend press freedom. And we can only rely on Congress. But it's scary. I worked as a journalist in Dubai for a Saudi outlet, and I got kicked out of the country for an article I wrote. Now, being a chief spokesperson talking about this, I don't want to go back to the Arab world. Journalists I talk with who report in MENA, the Middle East region, but also around the world, have talked about this is a chilling thing that has happened.
I was also struck by the clip of the Saudi newsreader talking about the official Saudi line on the killing. And maybe we can drill down a bit and talk about press freedom in a place like Saudi Arabia. Does it exist in any identifiable form?
Well, basically there's no independent media in Saudi Arabia. The government controls the media, it controls satellite television coverage. It's, according to our findings, it's the 10th most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist. Each year we release our World Press Freedom Index, which ranks 180 countries. Saudi Arabia is at the very bottom at 172. For all the talks about reform, Mohammed bin Salman has intensified repression since he was appointed Crown Prince. Since 2017, the number of journalists detained has tripled. According to our findings, there are 30 journalists detained in Saudi Arabia. 20 are professional journalists, 10 are non-professional journalists, so citizen journalists, bloggers. 1/3 of them have been victims of torture, which is a fairly common practice for prisoners of conscience, if you want. 1/3 have received their charges, have been charged, officially charged, which means that 2/3 have not been charged. Saudi Arabia has invested heavily in mass surveillance, and the authorities keep surveillance on reporters, journalists, even when they go abroad, as we saw with Jamal Khashoggi. It's a very, journalists who are reporting or providing political analysis are liable to be arrested or even put in jail. Usually the terms are very vaguely worded. There's, it's it's a little bit of a bleak picture at this stage. There's also just the elements of, promoting the messaging online, the use of troll farms, as we've seen, of bots. The use of bots is so rampant that they're commonly referred to as electronic flies because of the way they swarm on, anybody who's critical of the regime and voices dissent. So.
We think of Russia and bots, but Saudi Arabia is infamous for its use of bots. But with that as context, Greg, and this is speculative, what could MBS have been thinking? As if we're not going to notice the brutal murder in a consulate of a dissident critic of his regime. How could he have gamed out something as heinous and incompetent in some ways as this?
Yeah, I mean, this is the one place where maybe Trump got it right. I mean, he said if this was a cover-up, it's the worst cover-up imaginable. It's impossible to answer that question, but I think that what the other panelists are talking about in terms of just the climate in Saudi Arabia goes a long way toward explaining this. This is not a calculation being made in a democratic country of Western ideals. This is a calculation being made by a leader in a highly, highly repressive state who has been conditioned since birth to assume that things like this are not only can happen, but are supposed to happen, and that you are supposed to get away with it.
And the PR on him is that he was the reformer.
Right. And so I think that, that goes a long way toward explaining how something like this happens. And, as hideously clunky as this operation was, it tells us a lot about the family and MBS and his real nature.
Tom, step back a bit and speak, if you could, generally about video and filmmaking at the Washington Post. I've been at the Post a long time. We didn't have a video unit because there was obviously no place to put it until the web came around. But can you describe a bit more about our efforts in video?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, relative to the other departments at the Post, video is new. It's, I think, within the last, I'd say, 15 years, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I'm exaggerating, but at the Post, it's the unique challenge there is really trying to balance the relentless daily news cycle and trying to do pieces that are more thoughtful and maybe go deeper that take time. And so the video team has to sort of balance between going after stories that are breaking and then also stories that really need time to develop, like this one. So, when we do have time and we feel that there is a big story that deserves a lot of resources and effort, we will go after it. We talked about Greg's Pulitzer. In addition to that, we did a 2-part mini doc with Greg about his reporting on Russian interference in the election, and that found a new audience that maybe not, would have come to the Post. And that video also, that won a Murrow for investigative reporting, which is, it reaches a new audience, our Post journalism. So in that way, it's very valuable, and it's also very important. For Khashoggi, we were putting videos out almost, every day, if not every other day, sort of putting out statements, clips, everything that was sort of trickling out, interviewing our reporters who were there. And during that time, we knew that we wanted to put out something big like this. So, for 5 months while we were, addressing the daily news cycle, we were putting together this piece. It's a relatively small team, which is different from, what a documentary filmmaker might be used to. I think the core team was like 5 people who are also balancing other pieces that they're working on. So it's a unique place to do video, but it's we think it's a very important addition to the newsroom.
Let me zoom out and ask Courtney and Sabine about the threats to journalists and whether this emboldens regimes around the world. You could almost argue that it discourages, because the consequences of this have been substantial. We don't know what the resolution will be, but it's clear when the Senate is passing resolutions against Saudi Arabia that you don't get away with this. Official murder of journalists is discouraged. So, I mean, talk about and maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know that I agree. I think that the lack of any real, sanctions on those who were responsible, the fact that, an arms deal is being pushed through. We did see Germany restrict an arms deal, but frankly, Saudi Arabia is such an important military trading influential partner in the region. And, you heard reference to Qatar. I mean, there's an entire effort to kind of censor and retaliate against Qatar. I mean, it has been censoring Al Jazeera across the Gulf, restricting websites, really trying to manage the information space. And meanwhile, I mean, we talked about the level of murder of journalists, but we've also seen 3 years in a row of record highs, journalists who are being imprisoned for their work. So at least 250 journalists every year for the past year are in prison for their journalism. And only a state can put journalists in jail. And that means that no one is facing retaliation. And a key thread throughout this is, as Sabine alluded to, the surveillance issue. Now, the NSO group, which is an Israeli firm that is now being bought by a UK venture capital firm, is emblematic of the Western surveillance technologies that are being sold to very repressive governments that are then being used and implicated in the targeting of journalists, including for murder. So NSO Group Pegasus software was found on a friend of Khashoggi's on his phone. At least it has been linked to at least 9 journalists in Mexico who have been murdered. So, this issue, going back to what does justice look like and how do we fight back against what is a very, very challenging time for journalists, not only because of the action of states, but because they're just, they can't compete against the capabilities that states have to not only, imprison and kill them, but also to surveil them, to restrict and censor them, and of course, just the broader sustainability model. So I think it's a very, very challenging time for journalists when you add in also the disinformation campaigns.
Sabine, a green light.
Yeah, and I think that when it comes to spyware technology, we see that it opens the door to human rights abuses and to journalists. And it's just flabbergasting that there are no regulations. There's a lot of information sharing that happens between governments and private companies. It's a very shady market. It's a very lucrative market. I think it's no coincidence that Israel refers to spyware technology as a weapon because of its sweepingly intrusive capabilities. And this is something that is very disturbing in this day and age. That there's you have some agreement like the Wassenaar arrangement, which 42 countries have signed up to, but it's not really enforced, and that's something that we're pushing and that is coming to light.
Can I just add that Turkey has been really interesting in this. So Turkey has, first of all, I'd love to know how much was Turkey bugging the embassy? I mean, we know this happens, but how did we get all this intelligence out of it? but Turkey is the leading jailer of journalists. It accounts for between Turkey, China, and Egypt, they account for more than 50% of journalists in jail. So Turkey has been the leading jailer of journalists, and then it's trickling out all of this information day after day to keep it in the news, to burnish its image, whitewash, and it's making it hard not only to hold Saudi Arabia accountable, but to hold Turkey accountable because we need their intelligence.
I mean, the hypocrisy issue, it really looms large. Let me throw it open here to questions for the panel about the film or any of the broader issues. Yes, sir, go ahead. Did everybody hear the question? I can repeat it. I'll repeat it. It basically comes down to what can we expect from the United Nations given their limited powers, basically.
I mean, I think that's why Agnes Calamar's report is very important, because she lays out in great detail the justification for why the United Nations Secretary General is authorized, given the international crime and arguing for international jurisdiction. And she presents in a lot of detail about why the Secretary General should be authorized to open a criminal investigation. So it would probably take 2 hours to explain, but I would urge you to look at the report, because I think that's why it's very important that this has come and that she took it on herself as the independent expert, the special rapporteur, to go do this report and figure out what does a path towards justice look like and how can we justify that given the very political nature of the UN. But I would point out that the UN Secretary General created a special advisor role in his office for safety of journalists. So theoretically, there is a will to do that, but he's had very tepid responses about that. It's really a shame to see a lack of leadership from both the President of the United States and the Secretary General of the United Nations.
Which part of Julian Assange are you referring to? The early WikiLeaks or the campaign WikiLeaks?
I mean, I don't think that it necessarily matters, because right now you have an indictment against him that is essentially including the criminalization of journalism. So there are things in the, where he has now been charged under the Espionage Act, which the Obama administration really ramped up its use against journalistic sources, to try to find out confidential sources. The Trump administration said they're going to do the same, and they have. And many things, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear, frankly, from Greg, like many things that are listed in there, like talking to sources, encouraging them to use confidential, communication devices, asking them to get information, appear that they could be criminalized.
Yeah, of course, he goes one step farther, right? He offers to help actually sort of crack this encryption in this case, and that's something I don't think any of us at the Post would do, but I do think that the concerns about this prosecution are real. I think that it's gotten harder. I think that the way Paul set this up helps. I mean, shows that in the newsroom at the Washington Post and elsewhere, I think it's gotten harder to see Julian Assange as a new sort of kind of journalist over time, given what how he has behaved. But this is such a delicate and dangerous time for journalists and press freedoms generally that any erosion, even at the edges of our profession, are concerning.
Did you want to weigh in here, Sabine?
No, I agree with everything. I mean, for us, it's really treating, we don't consider Assange necessarily as a journalist as such, but we do consider him as a journalistic source. And as such, he should be, protected as far as press freedom are concerned.
Did we get that, everybody? The question is, has Trump listened to the audio and other intel around the Khashoggi case?
I'm not sure that we know that. I mean, I think obviously he's been briefed on it extensively. The audio, he clearly could listen to it. I think the U.S. intelligence community obviously possesses this, and I've spoken to many people in the stories we've written. We've had sources who describe it for us or describe what's in transcripts of it, and there are transcripts that exist that sort of talk about the sounds that come up in addition to what's said in the voices. But I'm not sure whether Trump himself has heard it.
Just as a practical matter, how is this audio, how does it exist? Do the Turks bug every consulate and embassy?
So do we.
Okay. I'm naive.
This is how we know what Mike Flynn said to Sergei Kislyak, right? I mean, these are what governments do. This is the Saudi Arabia is an adversary of Turkey. Turkey, of course, is going to devote. Turkey has substantial intelligence capabilities. It's clearly going to aim those resources at adversaries, including Saudi Arabia. And they had the consulate bug.
And again, just a comment about the blundering nature of this. The Saudis obviously knew they were bugged, and they went ahead anyway.
One of the weirdest things about the intelligence world is what is sort of the common sense that should prevail and yet rarely does, right? I mean, again, you could say the same thing about Mike Flynn. He knew his conversation with Sergei Kislyak had to be recorded, but he says what he does anyway. In this case, you become complacent. Perhaps they believe that the resources would be aimed at the embassy and that they perhaps had scrubbed the consulate and thought that it was clean. I think one of the interesting things, though, that we saw in this case that we also see more of, and it's an echo of the Russia interference story in another way, is the kind of use of or weaponization of intelligence after the fact. I mean, for a long time, countries have had these espionage capabilities, but they hold them tight, right? They do not reveal them to the world. In this case, the Turks then turned this information and released it to Turkish news organizations in a weaponized way against the kingdom.
This is the scene in every spy movie where the two people go for a walk in the park so they won't be bugged. So I imagine there's some realistic
Now you have CCTV cameras.
Oh, right. Then they have that. I'm sorry, I think you were next, sir.
So that, again, like in the report, Agnes talks about several potential avenues. I think that the private, there might be an avenue, but then the question is what jurisdiction? Because in the United States, you can't try somebody in absentia, so that doesn't work. And then you would say, okay, well, who is the claimant going to be, and do they have standing? And I think it's challenging, but it's definitely something we're looking at. I mean, I think that frankly, the path to justice will include many different paths.
And I would just add that I think that the Saudis and MBS in particular are more than happy to throw a lot of money at this problem to make it go away. That's not going to be very painful to the kingdom. We've seen Jamal's own family kind of be very silent about this ever since this happened, in part because his eldest son still lives in Saudi Arabia, has a career there as a banker, wants to remain there, and this is the price the family pays for that to continue to happen. The Saudis have thrown millions of dollars at the family.
I think we have time for one more. Yes, sir. Yeah, the question is a good one. It's about what might have set off the Saudis specifically or more generally. Yeah, or was he holding on to some secrets? I don't, Greg, maybe you know?
I think that's puzzling. I mean, when you read his columns, they're very measured, at least by our standards, right? He is not a fire-breathing critic of the kingdom. He is not calling for the end of the royal family. These are measured pieces. He's a sort of an institutionalist. He comes out of the kingdom. He thrived in it for many years. But I think that it was as this excellent documentary alluded to, it was in part that here is somebody they had counted on suddenly emerging on the distance as a critic and then surfacing at a platform like the Post, which is reaching an audience that the Saudis care about.
Yeah, and I can just add to that. I mean, the Saudis spent millions and millions of dollars in Washington on PR. They spent a lot of money to get that whole image out in the media that he's a reformer, that somehow allowing women to drive in 2018 is reform. So
As long as they don't take part in the reforms.
Right, I
He
mean,
wants to
I
take
think-
credit for it.
yeah, so I think that, he had a very powerful microphone, a platform being in the Washington Post, which is one of the most influential outlets in the United States and therefore the world, and has the ear of policymakers at a time when they have this huge reform effort going on.
And
And
one of
if,
the innovative things that the opinion section did with Jamal's columns was to translate them into Arabic so that the Arab world could read them. That also probably didn't make Saudi Arabia happy.
If I can just raise one point, because you were talking earlier about visibility and whether they'll try to take a bit of a lower profile, but at the end of the month, you have the G20 that's taking place in Osaka, Japan, and Saudi Arabia will take over the presidency of the G20. For our part, we've been calling Saudi Arabia to release all detained journalists as a gesture to take presidency and for such a influential and important role.
Good point. Yes, sir. You had a question. Wonderful question. The question is, would we be even discussing this perhaps as an issue if Jamal had not been associated with the Washington Post? And you guys take it.
It's hard to say. We, for instance, found out fairly recently that there were two foreign journalists who had been kidnapped in Saudi Arabia, a Jordanian journalist and a Yemeni journalist. We still don't know their whereabouts. One of them spoke to his wife very briefly just to prove that he was alive, but there's not more information. I mean, it's so opaque that it's.
Can I end on a
Very-
positive note? Because I think that one of the things that has happened with this, no, I don't actually think that it would be, I think it would be a huge thing, but we have seen media organizations realize that they have to stand up for their journalists and really become advocates for press freedom and journalist safety in a way that they haven't been before. And you've seen this with the Washington Post Press Freedom Partnership. And at the beginning of the year, Forbes and a bunch of other organizations created, a bunch of other news organizations created the One Free Press Coalition. And so every month The media outlets who are part of this coalition are agreeing to publish a list of the top 10 most urgent cases, which CPJ and the International Women's Media Foundation put together for them. They published that list of the 10 most urgent cases, reaching more than 1 billion people for that precise reason, that it is through the spotlight that you might find justice.
I just want to observe, and I wrote something about this back when, that the Saudis have waged war on Yemen, killing thousands, starving thousands, bombing school buses of children, and it barely got a ripple in America. The fact of that it was one identifiable human being, a high-profile human being, really did galvanize this issue. And so you can say that's distorted and weird, but it is a fact that we responded to an individual murder as opposed to mass murder.
But it helped leverage that attention for Yemen. And now Yemen is on the agenda in a way that it never was.
The question is the Washington Post vulnerable to attack because of our prominence to possibly undermined regimes, autocratic regimes around the world? I would just say personally, I don't think we have that much power, but under attack, we're under attack by the President of the United States constantly. So I imagine
enemy of the
this is
people.
another threat. But you guys want to comment? No. Okay. Okay. Further questions? Yes, sir.
There's a journalist memorial, a memorial to murdered journalists that will be constructed in Washington. It's going to be, it's starting now, which we also know that the museum is closing, and so the First Amendment, which currently sits in giant letters on Pennsylvania Avenue, is going to be dismantled. And the symbolism of that can hardly be overstated.
Yes.
And I think it's also kind of, the visibility is necessary. I think there's not necessarily an awareness of the extent to which press freedom around the world are eroding. I mean, I think it's about 10% of countries across the world who live in healthy press environments. And as we were talking earlier about the importance of coalitions, I think that speaking with one voice is now more important than ever, and these coalitions definitely help in bringing across these messages and the vulnerability, targeting of journalists around the world.
Great. Any more? Anybody else? Yes, sir.
It's very scary, and it's not only deep fakes. I mean, you have light fakes where you just play with audio, or as we saw with Nancy Pelosi, which can be extremely misleading, and that's technology that's been around for a while and that's very easily accessible. So it is very worrying.
And we've already seen that happen. There have been cases of, especially female journalists, where videos are made to make it look like they're in a pornography, and then those are sent around, leading to death threats, rape threats. We have assisted journalists, for example, a journalist in India who had that video to get out of the country. She had to leave for her physical safety. Luckily, she's back now, but she reports on corruption against Modi. So, we're deeply concerned about this. And we're looking at, so much of the video relied on kind of this audio and this video. And I wonder, I think it'd be interesting to hear from you as a filmmaker, what you think,
Yeah, I mean, I think deep fakes and light fakes. I think it's an extension, really, the next progression of attacking people you don't agree with. I mean, it's readily available. You could download the program and do it yourself. You don't have to be a regime to do these things, which is, frankly, it's terrifying. And you could attack your neighbor. You could, I mean, it's weaponizing this video technology in a way that we have not seen before. I don't think there's any legislation yet over it. We have covered it at the Post. If you're curious, we did a video about it. You can go watch it. I mean, well, I think we might see it in the next campaign cycle. We've already seen it against Pelosi. In other countries where they're combating fake news during an election, we'll see it. We saw it in India. I think we're just going to see more of it. Our video team works to authenticate video when it comes out. Bellingcat up in New York does a lot of great work with that. So the quicker we can sort of get the real video out, the better. And I think more newsrooms across the country are hopefully staffing up on that.
Way in the back, yes. The question was, Turkey has been dribbling out information. Do we know how much they are actually still withholding? It's beyond me.
It's not clear how much they are still sitting on. I mean, there is no publicly available audio, I don't think. That's still very closely held. I'm sure that there is a great deal of imagery and additional reporting that they haven't released, and although they may have shared it government to government with U.S. officials. So I'm not sure that there is a lot left. I mean, one of the big questions, as the documentary said, is that, I mean, there are still huge questions about what happened here. We still don't know what happened to Jamal's body. Even now, the UN report that came out this week talked about images of Saudis going from the consulate to the consular official's residence with a suitcase and bags, right? And it looks awfully suspicious, but nobody knows. The Turks were not allowed to really search that site exhaustively, including a well that's on the property. Jamal's fiance was visiting with us at the Washington Post just a few weeks ago and said that, this is one thing that she still has no idea, even in her conversations with Turkish officials, and she lives in Turkey, she does not know what happened to his remains.
Is there another one in the back? No? Thank you. If any more? No? I think we're done. Thank you. Appreciate it.